Okay, now it's time for Papa Houston's story. Check out that dashing young airman there. That was a photo of my Papa right before he deployed and went overseas, after he was finishing up with all his training and boot camp and gunnery school and that kind of stuff. I'm often asked, like, Taluki, where did you get your striking good looks from? Well, there you go, some photographic evidence. Kidding around. Actually, I don't think I'm probably even close to as good looking as Papa Houston was back in the day. Well, at least I'm far better looking than my uncles Craig and Uncle Scott. I didn't put any photos of them up there because I didn't want to frighten everybody. Anyway, so Papa Houston, okay, he grew up and came from a very humble, modest background as well. Basically, a poor farm kid down in Kentucky, small family farm that he grew up on. He went into basic like grammar school, like my other grandfather, kind of a one-room schoolhouse where he was learning reading, writing, arithmetic. Stories from his childhood. I always remember him telling me that he kind of called himself like a little hillbilly kid through the summertime, where he's like you couldn't get him to put shoes on, and he'd run around barefoot all summer long, kind of working on the farm, doing what kids would do down there. And he said like his feet would get so calloused up that he could walk right across like driveways of gravel and whatnot, and wouldn't phase him at all. Because I always remember when I was a kid, if I took my shoes off in the summertime and was walking, I'd be like, ah, ooh, ah. And you're like, man, that wouldn't phase me at all back when I was a kid. Of course, I wore shoes most of the time too, so my feet never toughened up. Uh, anyway, Papa Houston, similar education to background to my grandpa Stan, where he was in like a one-room schoolhouse, learning reading, writing, arithmetic, but working on the farm quite a bit too. Well, most people down south were lived kind of below the poverty line. And we had talked a while ago about like the Great Migration back in the 19 teens and 20s, where a lot of black families left the South, of course, because of like Jim Crow racism and oppression that was going on down there back then, specifically targeting the black community. But the North offered better job and educational opportunities. Well, it wasn't just black families that were moving up north. Millions of white families did too. They came up north looking for better opportunities, a chance to make a better life for their family and earn more money and higher wages. Well, definitely coming up and working in the auto industry would pay a lot better and give you much more material wealth than being a small-time farmer. So his whole family eventually transitioned up here, and I think my papa was about in 8th grade when he came up too. Now he finished high school, went all the way through, which that wasn't as common back then as it is today. So I'd even say that he was, for the time, kind of fairly highly educated, because it was super rare to go to college unless you were kind of like elite and wealthy and upper crust. But Papa Houston actually even he didn't go to an actual like college or university, but he did get some post high school training as well. Now, about the time he was finishing up with that was when World War II broke out, and then the Pearl Harbor attack happens, and young men start getting drafted up and called to serve their country. Well, I guess his draft number had basically come up, but he hadn't been ordered to report for duty yet. And he made the decision that, rather than going into the infantry or getting put in the Navy, because if you did get drafted, probably this is a kind of a ballpark guess, but probably about a 75% chance you at that point in the war you were going to get put into the army and just be infantry. Or then the other thing is they would sort some guys out and put them onto naval ships and transport vessels. But not many guys were getting selected to go into the Air Corps, which is kind of a new part of the Army. Now, the Air Force was not its own separate branch back in this era as it is today. Back then, if you were in the Air Force, essentially, it was the Army Air Corps. It was part of the Army. So Papa Houston, before he could actually get drafted, he went and enlisted and volunteered and specifically requested to be an airman. So that's kind of cool. You know what I mean? He saw that new technology coming out and those planes flying around super fast. And of course, being a poor farm kid from Kentucky or even up working in the auto industry, the odds of you ever getting to fly like state-of-the-art aircraft like that would be very low unless you went into the military and under circumstances kind of like this. Well, initially, now Papa Houston is a very smart, very intelligent guy. He might not have a college or university degree, but no doubt in my mind, he would have been capable of earning that, no problem. Super bright guy, very, very savvy. So he also is quite fit. He cut a good figure, man, and is about the right size to be a pilot. You can't be like 6'5" or like super short either. You have to be kind of in a range of height and have a kind of slim build to qualify to be in flight school. Especially even back at that time, just due to the size of like the cockpits and stuff in P-51 Mustangs. Also, they definitely didn't let any dummies do that. You had to have decent test scores and stuff and have a fairly high aptitude to qualify for like pilot school. Well, he qualified for that and was hoping to go fly P-51 Mustangs, those fighter planes, the best fighter planes that we really had through the war. However, his mother, I guess, freaked out about that. So my great grandma, that worried her a lot. You know what I mean? She's like, man, that sounds really, really dangerous. So, at his mother's request, because she was really concerned about him being a fighter pilot and them having super high like casualty rates, he asked to get transferred to a bomber crew, where a younger guy at his age he would have almost certainly gone in to be a gunner, which is what ended up happening. Now, I guess the story goes after he comes out of gunnery school, he's talking to his mom again before he gets deployed and kind of explains what he's going to be doing as a top turret gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress. And she said, so the story goes, something to the effect of, boy, that sounds pretty dangerous. If you're going to be up there, I would have rather you just been the one flying the plane. To which I'm sure Papa Houston had some sort of reaction in his head like, oh, mother, are you kidding me? So after all that and him getting the transfer and all that, then it was like she would have preferred he would have been a fighter pilot anyway, which, man, that would be a whole different set of stories if that had happened. Now, if that's something we could go back and change in history, I'm not sure that I would do it either because, Papa Houston does survive the war on his B-17 Flying Fortress, but who knows how things would have panned out if he had been a fighter pilot. Maybe I wouldn't be here now, talking to you if that had happened, because being a fighter pilot was a super dangerous job as well. So anyway, Papa Houston goes out, like, before you can go up and actually fly in the 8th Air Force and go on combat missions, you had to learn how to shoot first, because you can imagine firing 50 cal machine guns up in the air in a moving plane, and you're firing at another moving fighter plane, somebody from the German Luftwaffe. That's kind of tricky. It's not like just going out target shooting in your backyard. Now, it is a very challenging thing to fire with all of those variables going on. When he went to the gunnery school in Vegas, I guess he was an outstanding marksman, and he went in with a group of 300 guys. And at the end of it, they kind of would tell you your rankings, and he made the top 10 list out of 300 guys. So pretty elite group. And I guess he and some of the other guys asked, well, who was the number one, number two? Can we have the breakdown of the top 10? And they didn't have that data and wouldn't tell them, or maybe they did have the data and they didn't release information like that. But Papa Houston did say that, when he would look at the targets after he shot them, that he had hit bullseyes basically on every one of the scored shoots. So he thinks, according to him, that he feels like he probably finished possibly number one in the class. Of course, there could have been other guys in the gunnery school that had just as good, marksmanship scores as him. So, at the very least, he probably at least was the number one guy or tied. Now, a lot of people, if they told you a story like that, you might blow it off and say, ugh, they're just bragging. And you know what I mean? Being braggadocio and tooting their own horn. For sure, if my Uncle Craig or Uncle Scott were in that spot and were telling me that, I'd be like, okay, sure you did. But the thing is, Papa Houston is a super modest guy. I know you guys don't know him, but I've spent tons of time with him, and he never brags about anything. So honestly, coming from a guy like Papa Houston, I think if he was saying that, he probably did finish right at the very top of the pack there. So he's a darn good shot. And that probably goes back to his childhood in Kentucky, too, because he did get quite a bit of experience shooting out on the farm and going hunting back when he was a kid. So it probably paid off at gunnery school. So now, he's out of gunnery school. He's getting deployed overseas. The 8th Air Force, as it was called, the 8th Air Force was the division of the Army, that Air Corps that was bombing Nazi Germany. So if you hear about any airmen like the Memphis Belle, for example, that we had talked about, and I showed you some scenes from that movie. They were in the 8th Air Force as well, the same as my Papa Houston. But there were so many guys and so many crews in the 8th Air Force. They didn't keep them all on at one airfield or in one town. They were scattered across southern England. So my Papa was in Ipswich, England, which I don't know much about it other than that's where my Papa was stationed. But apparently a small town in southern England. Now, going over there, you can imagine these guys are living over in England for extended periods of time. So they make friends with the local population. They get to know all the British people, are eating in their restaurants, going out, flirting with their daughters and such, and, drinking at the local pubs. I guess an old kind of a jokey type saying that the people in England would often say about our airmen in the 8th Air Force that were stationed over there was the problem with airmen is that they're overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But I would have to imagine that Papa Houston, who is a very conservative guy, he's super polite, well-mannered, and also very religion, very Christian man. I don't think he was over there raising too much hell in southern England, but hopefully he found a little time to get into some mischief. But I got to imagine that if you were going to have soldiers come and stationed right next to your house, he's the kind of guy you would want by you because, like I said, he is a very honorable, decent, nice guy. And it sounded like from most of his stories, actually most of the airmen were pretty good dudes. But remember, like flyboys, and this goes back to even World War I, they always had the reputation of being kind of those dapper guys with the cool uniforms and a little more prestigious. And they did often have the reputation of being like partiers and drinkers and out at the clubs. It's just something about that's often associated with the pilots and flyboys and airmen. So anyway, like when he went over there initially, let me go on to the next slide now. Here we go. There's his crew. Now, initially, he had 10 guys in his crew. That was like from the scenes in the movie Memphis Belle. That was a 10-man crew. But that was during 1943. The Memphis Belle was the very first crew to complete its tour of duty. By the time you get to 1944, and my Papa flies from the fall of 44 to the spring of 45. Basically, his last mission was like weeks before the end of the war in Europe. So his last mission was just like right at towards the end of the war when everything wraps up over there. But really, like through 1943, when the movie Memphis Belle would have been going on, the German Luftwaffe was quite strong. So the biggest threat to Allied bomber crews was, at least American bomber crews that are flying during daylight hours, it was German fighter planes coming up trying to shoot them down. Now, by 1944, by the time Papa Houston's over there, the German Luftwaffe has been beat up pretty bad. They don't have as many planes. A lot of their best pilots are goners by then. But the thing that made it more challenging and maybe even a little more dangerous by 1944 and 45 was the anti-aircraft, the flak, was much heavier and thicker because Hitler had given an order and he had repositioned a lot of his anti-aircraft guns around these prime German factories and cities and targets. So flying through, like when you get to the bomb run and the flak starts coming up, that was actually much thicker and much more dangerous for these guys. Anyway, so his crew initially was he trained back before they started flying combat missions with a 10-man crew. But then once they got over there, they made that shift to 9-man crews because the two waist gunners kind of in the middle belly part of the plane, by that point, because there was less German fighters, one guy could operate both of those guns and go back and forth. So that guy and I'm not sure what his name was, but my Papa Houston for sure remembers him and has mentioned it before to me. He got transferred to a different crew. Also, the guy that was the bottom ball turret gunner on his crew, which my Papa was the top turret gunner on the top of the plane. The ball turret guy, he got bumped off of the crew because somebody else with seniority bumped onto my Papa's crew. So once they were set with those 9 guys, that was his 9-man crew for the rest of the war. Kind of a sad part of the story. Both of the guys that got transferred out of his crew that he had trained with early on went to different crews, and both of them got shot down and did not survive the war. So man, that kind of hits close to home too. He knew those guys pretty well and had trained with them, and that's just speaks to how dangerous it was being an airman. Which Papa Houston often would tell me when he was telling me stories about this, because he was always very open about his experiences during World War II, which I loved as a kid. I ate that up. I loved hearing him talk about it, and I loved sitting and watching war movies with him. Uh, he said that his heart really went out to guys that were in the infantry, guys like my grandpa Stan, who were out there on the front lines fighting through the rain, the snow, the muck, seeing the enemy up close, face to face. He said, man, those conditions would have been really trying, and it would have been often quite miserable. Where in contrast, the guys, the airmen, they had a warm bed to sleep in every night. They probably had better food. They got to hang out with, friendly British people and go to parties or bars and stuff every now and then. The trade-off was that the airmen actually did statistically the most dangerous job. So even though they lived in more relative comfort, when they actually did go fly these combat missions, the odds of them dying and not coming back home were way up. So you kind of had better odds of surviving if you were actually out in the infantry, but you'd probably lived a little bit more comfortable if you were one of the airmen. So kind of a trade-off. I remember we had talked about that a little bit back in World War I as well. So I guess Papa Houston had the fortune of getting teamed up with a really, really good, experienced pilot. Another thing, when I would sit and watch movies with him as a kid, like we watched Memphis Belle together once, he was kind of critical of that movie. He said, it depicts the B-17 really well. Some of the action scenes are good. It shows some real challenges and obstacles that these air crews would have to overcome. But he said what he didn't like about the movie was, and remember, I told you this, if you did watch the scenes of the movie with my commentary, that they fictionalized all the characters in that movie. Now, there really was a real Memphis Belle crew, but they didn't use the names or even try to mimic the personalities of the real guys from that crew. That was all fictionalized. And constantly throughout the movie, they're talking back to the captain. They're kind of giving nasty jokes to each other. There's tension and drama. Papa Houston said that, his crew was nothing like that. That if the captain gave an order, everybody on his crew respected their captain tremendously. And they trusted him with their lives. And if he gave an order, you followed the order. He said there was no back talk, that they were a close-knit team, kind of a band of brothers, if you will, where they're trusting each other with their lives, and they know that by working together, that's their best odds of surviving the war and getting back home. So he said a lot of that. He thought, there could have been other air crews, other bomber crews that did have that tension and drama, but he said most of the crews that he knew were actually highly disciplined and followed orders. And there's a lot of that drama in the movies. They put that kind of stuff in movies so they can sell more tickets and have more drama in the film. But often that's not true to real life conditions or what actually went down. So he had a very experienced captain. Part of having an experienced, top-notch captain was they ended up being a lead plane in their squadron. So they often were the front plane in this whole formation of bombers, where all of the other planes in the formation will queue and watch that lead plane, and they follow its lead. And then when that plane drops its bombs, they'll all drop their bombs. Lead planes also had some special state-of-the-art radar equipment that would get transferred in and out and was constantly being tinkered with. So the crew Memphis Belle that we had talked about, and I showed you the image where it was the Memphis Belle was supposed to be the captain's good-looking girlfriend from Memphis, Tennessee, and they had a painting of her on the front nose of the plane. In real life, if you most bomber crews did have a name, had a logo that the captain would pick and they would paint up there. But if you were a lead plane, you didn't get that because lead planes got rotated in and out. So every time my papa flew a mission, he would be flying with the same guys, but they would be on a different plane each time. Now, if they had their own one permanent plane, their crew's name, because they still picked a name, a team name, was the Cultured Vulture. Actually, and I thought this was a really cool part of the story. At least I appreciated it a lot. My Papa Houston was the one that actually drew up their artwork. So that image right there is like the logo, what would have been on the nose of their bomber had they had their one own permanent bomber that they kept for every mission. So you got the big vulture up there, and then it's got one of its feet resting on a skull. And I don't know if you look real close there, you can probably tell the skull has a little Hitler mustache and Hitler haircut. So I always thought that's pretty awesome. That's way cooler than having some Southern girl painted on the nose of your plane. I love something like this, like the vulture coming to drop bombs on the Nazis. So anyway, they're a lead plane, which that often made you more of a target because the Germans know, and they have bomber crews, or at one time had their own bomber crews, and know the lead planes are the most important. So really, statistically, that's even kind of one of the more dangerous jobs, being that front point plane. Now, you would fly 30 missions, and that was your tour of duty. Let me go on to the next slide here. So over there is a list of all the missions, all the combat missions that my papa flew. Now, actually being a lead plane, they would fly a lot more training missions than other crews. So he actually got more airtime than most normal airmen or crewmen of a B-17 would, because they were flying lots of training missions too. But he ended up flying 29 combat missions, and 30 was the mark you had to hit to finish your tour of duty. Now, he actually completed his tour of duty, but the reason for that was why he didn't hit 30. His pilot had subbed on another crew and flew one extra mission. And typically, the airmen on one crew, you're tied to your pilot. So in his case, once the pilot had hit 30, the rest of them were close enough that they just finished up their tour. Now, why would they do 30 missions and you're out? Well, think about it. This is statistically like the most dangerous job you can have in the war. So if airmen were just told, you're just going to keep flying missions until, well, the war is over, or until you end up getting shot down and killed, that's kind of a depressing thing. It doesn't really give you a lot of hope. Also, like today, we know the war ends in the spring of 1945, but they didn't know that back at the time. Maybe the war was going to go on until 1946, 47, 48. There really was no way of knowing. So setting that mark of like you hit 30 combat missions, it's like it's a dangerous job, but you get through those 30 missions and you made it. Now, you could go and sub on other crews because occasionally, a plane wouldn't get shot down, but they might take heavy fire or something, and one or two guys on the crew might get killed. So like if a German fighter plane came in and shot and killed their top turret gunner, Papa Houston could have went and subbed on one of those crews when his crew wasn't up in the rotation to go fly. He could fly an extra mission, and it would count on his list and get him out of the war a little bit sooner. However, he knew a lot of guys. That was a common thing because a lot of guys wanted to get back home and wanted to have their tour of duty done. But he knew multiple guys that had subbed on other crews and then ended up getting shot down when they were out doing that submission with another crew. And he kind of felt like his crew was so close knit and they trusted each other, they worked good together, that he felt like, just all things considered, how dangerous this job was. He felt like his best odds of getting back home were just to fly his missions, not to rush it, and stay with the guys that he knew, was comfortable with, and trusted. Now, the conditions up there in any B-17 bomber, I think these planes fly super high. It's not like World War I anymore, where they're just kind of buzzing the trenches and flying, at max, like probably a mile above the sky. These planes would fly, their max altitude, it would be about 25,000 feet. So think about that. That's like up 5 miles in the sky. What's it like when you're 5 miles up, when you're at 25,000 foot elevation? It's frigid cold. Even in the middle of summertime, it's sub-zero temperatures up there. They taught you in the movie Memphis Belle, you'd see those guys wearing those heavy like bomber jackets with wool liners. Well, those bomber jackets, they look awesome and they're really cool, but it had a practical purpose to keep these guys warm up there when it was 20, 30, 40, 50 below, when they're flying these missions, and they're up there for long, sometimes 14, 16, 20 hours. So it's a long time to be up there and be really cold and exposed to that. Now, They'd also have to wear gloves and stuff. If you ever seen the movie Christmas Story, where that kid goes out and licks the phone pole in the middle of winter and his tongue sticks to it, well, if you had just a little moisture or sweat on your hands and you went up and then a fighter's coming in and you touch your gun and grab it, your hands would freeze right to the metal. So you had to wear those gloves, and also when you get up that high, the oxygen is super thin. So think that in the movie Memphis Belle, they're constantly taking their masks off, those oxygen masks. And that's because it's a movie and they want to show the actors' faces and stuff. But when you're flying that high up, you had to keep that oxygen mask off. You might be able to take it off for a few seconds or something or readjust. But if you take that off for an extended period of time, you're going to black out. It's going to make you, pass out because your brain's not going to get enough oxygen. Once you would come down to about 10,000 feet, then you could take your oxygen off. It wouldn't be quite as cold. But for a lot of the mission, they're flying sky high up there. Also it's loud. I mean, think like the roar of those engines, and then you have open windows in the plane. I guess the roar was just incredibly loud. And I talked about how my grandpa Stan had major hearing loss, from grenades going off and artillery and mortars and firing his own gun. Well, I imagine the same would potentially be true for all of these airmen too, except because it was just so loud all the time, you wouldn't be able to talk to the guys even sitting like right next to you. You had to wear like earmuffs because these guys needed to communicate. So actually, they had some more state of the art technology for the time, and they wore like earmuffs. They almost look like shooting muffs that you would wear today if you were out shooting your rifle or something. But they had a comm system in them. So when you would talk, you would talk into like a little microphone there, and anybody else on your crew that had their headset on, which everybody should have those on, would hear what you said. So you couldn't be blabbing your mouth the whole time up there because you're going to tie up the comm and messages wouldn't be conveyed around. So most of the time you were supposed to kind of zip it and be quiet. The captain would give out orders and everybody's looking for enemy fighters. And if you see one, you call it out. And then everybody on the crew is looking in that direction, trying to find the bogeys that are coming for you. Now, they also had a radio system on the plane where they could communicate, if necessary, with other planes in the squadron. So multiple layers of radios up there. Let me think here. The top turret. Oh, so my grandpa was a top turret gunner. The turrets had it was on a hydraulic swivel. Now, to give you a little more insight into how loud it is, his station, that top turret, is about 5 or 6 feet behind the pilot and co-pilot. Well, I guess one mission where Papa Houston was up there, he had his flak jacket on, and they must have been getting kind of closer to the bombing run, but he was looking around, hadn't seen any planes, and he was about to get out of the turret. But his flak jacket caught on kind of like the joystick that would take it and turn it and swivel it. And he had taken his comm set off because they weren't that comfortable. So he had taken that and hung it up over, kind of on the wall of the plane. But it was at a place where he couldn't reach it. And then he was getting out of the turret and he pulled that hydraulic swivel on accident and it pinched him. It pressed his chest and back into the turret and trapped him in there and was crushing him. And he said he yelled and yelled at the pilot and co-pilot who were literally a few feet away from him, and they couldn't hear anything he was saying. Now, I guess eventually he was able to reach back there and get himself freed up. And afterwards, when he got home from that mission, he had a big bruise on his chest and back. And he said, he had nobody to blame but himself. If he had been wearing his comm set like he was supposed to, he could have just said in there that, somebody come help me out. And somebody else on the crew would have been right over there to help him with it. But he had taken that comm set off, and even being just a few feet away from, another guy on your crew, they wouldn't be able to hear you because it's just so darn loud up there. Now, I also asked my papa quite a few times, if he had any other memorable moments or just crazy war stories or scary experiences. And, one that always stuck with us grandkids was that he said, the first time he ever flew in a combat mission and was coming into the bomb run, and the top turret gunner is kind of his spot is several feet behind the cockpit of the plane. So he had a good view looking out ahead of him. The first time he ever flew a combat mission was coming into that bomb run and started seeing the flak blowing up, and boom, you could hear the puffs and these massive explosions going on right outside the plane, that he said it just sent a chill down his spine. And he just felt like, oh boy, I'm in it now, because he realized, that's the most dangerous part of the mission. And, he could literally be killed at any second. One of those cannons could hit him. So I guess on subsequent missions, he said he didn't have that bone chilling, just blood curdling, kind of moment of terror, because you get used to it, and he adapted and kind of acclimated to it. But he did say that first mission ever, when he came into the bomb run and started seeing the flak field ahead of him, that was kind of a terrifying experience. To give you an idea of how powerful those anti-aircraft guns are, another pretty memorable story was, by this point in the war, 1944, we would have bomber escorts escort these squadrons of bombers, which would be a squadron of P-51s that would fly with them. And if the German Luftwaffe showed up and tried shooting our bombers down, well, then we would have these maneuverable fighter planes defending them, and they could go fight off the German fighter planes. He said one time they were also coming into the bomb run, and he was, doing his checks and going back and forth, kind of being vigilant and looking around in the sky. And he happened to notice a P-51 Mustang that flew up right next to him, and he could actually see the pilot in there. They kind of made eye contact, and he said that the pilot of that P-51, they made eye contact together, and he kind of tipped his wings, basically giving him a wave. And I guess Papa Houston kind of took his guns and put them up and down like that to give a wave back. And then seconds later, he went over and he checked the other side, and then he heard boom, a flak explosion to the side of the plane. And by the time he turned back over, that P-51 Mustang was gone, and it had taken a direct hit from one of these anti-aircraft guns, and bam, blown to smithereens, nothing left, and that pilot is a goner. And I guess that was kind of a chilling experience too, because, what are the odds that could have just as easily hit Papa Houston's plane? And if you take a hit like that, even in a big bomber, good chance it's going to take your plane right down. And generally, when planes went down, there are sometimes, I guess, guys could get out and use their parachute and float down to safety and be taken as a POW, because you're going to be behind German lines. But most of the time, when one of these B-17s went down, the crew was goners. I also often asked Papa Houston, like, did you ever feel like you actually shot down a German fighter when you would see them coming around? And remember, he was one of the best gunners out of his class, so I figured, hey, if any of these machine gunners on a B-17 crew is going to take out some a German fighter plane, Papa Houston's as good a bet as any of them to do it. And he said, that it was really hard to tell, because it's a lot of chaos up there. You're flying in a tight formation, and if you had those fighters coming in like that, you're going to have hopefully multiple gunners, like all the top gunners in a squadron ideally are shooting at that plane. So it's hard to tell who's actually maybe hit the plane. He said he did see German like Me-109s go down, where for sure it was that their squadron took that plane out. But whether he was the one that fired the shots that actually took the plane down or not, pretty hard to tell. He did say that he felt like there was 2 occasions where he saw German planes go down that he was shooting at, that he felt like he probably got them. But again, it's really hard to tell up there, and he never actually pursued trying to get a confirmed kill. I'm not quite sure what the process was, but you had to have several other airmen also verify that you took the shot like that. And honestly, at the end of the day, it's all about getting your job done, doing your duty, and surviving and getting back home. So that kind of gets at most of the most memorable stories that I'd want to share with you guys regarding Papa Houston's experience over there during World War II. I'll tell you what, what a crazy time to live through. And when we talk about like the greatest generation, man, I think both of my grandpas are great examples of why that generation as a whole, and definitely know that their stories, while they are unique to them, are also at the same time very common. There were millions of young men that had very similar experiences, grew up during the Depression too, and then went over there, sacrificed, were courageous, and won this war for America and put down fascist Nazi Germany. Um, you know, Papa Houston and my grandpa Stan both went on to live amazing lives after the war, which is a big credit to them because, you know, it's really, I think, easy for a lot of guys that go through traumatic experiences like this to shut down and for it to change them and scar them. And I'll tell you what, both of these guys were just amazing human beings that were so kind and gentle and just such positive role models to me. And then at the same time, they also would often share these experiences with me, which was so cool to me as a kid that was really into history. I love that. And I'm so eternally grateful for having both of these fine men as my grandfathers. So I hope I did them proud with this retelling of some of their experiences. Um, they truly are a part of what makes the greatest generation the greatest generation. So with that, I'll sign off. I hope you enjoyed their experiences, and hopefully maybe it inspires you to go look into some of your family's background and check out some cool stories, whether it's World War II related or not. Go see what your family's done and look into your family's past. I can tell you I had a lot of fun putting this whole presentation together. Take care.